Hello, hello. You know what you should be doing? You should be protecting the things you use the most with Tile. It's a nifty, tiny Bluetooth tracker that makes losing your things a thing of the past. It's a wonderful gadget. Get free shipping and save 30% on a multi-pack, and also for a limited time, get a free gift box and help us by going to gettile.com/wethepeople. That's gettile.com/wethepeople. G'day, humans. Welcome to We the People Live, the discussion show for planet Earth, the place that makes debate healthy again. I'm Josh Zepps, and today it's part one of a two-part sit-down with Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, podcaster, writer, philosopher king for some of you. I really wanted to sit down with Sam because I wanted to discuss how he thinks of his role in public debate. I mean, this is a show, We the People Live, is a show that is really trying to bridge the conversational chasm that seems to have opened up between left and right these days, and just to bust out of easy talking points and think about things in unusual ways and talk about them in ways that can actually resonate with people on the other side of the aisle. You know, we don't want to be talking inside of our echo chambers. We want to be talking in ways that can withstand rational scrutiny, regardless of what your pre-existing beliefs are. And podcasting has provided a venue in which those sorts of in-depth, highbrow conversations are possible. And Sam Harris has sort of accidentally, in a way, blundered into being one of the great sort of proponents of that kind of conversation. This show is, by the way, going to be soon launching something we're going to call We the People Nation, which is a community of citizens committed to the project of speaking in bullshit-free ways about the biggest issues of our time. So if you want to be at the front of the pack for that, please do continue to follow me on Twitter at Josh Zepps, or follow the show at WTP_live. Just keep your eyes peeled in the coming weeks, because there's going to be all kinds of exciting stuff for you. But what I really wanted to do in this sort of cliche-free zone where I try to have meaningful conversations with interesting minds was to know what Sam Harris thinks of the role of the public intellectual, what he thinks of essentially his role, and to some extent, my role. We talk about free speech, we talk about campus protests, we talk about Black Lives Matter and the snowflake phenomenon. We talk about how he writes and how he thinks, how he finds his muse. But without further ado, I give you the one and only Sam Harris.
This is We the People Live.
Sam, thanks for being back on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
If I'd come to you 15 years ago, right, so, you know, we're in the aftermath of 9/11, beginning of the Afghan war, and I'd said to you, okay, in 15 years' time, you're going to be on my podcast. And a podcast, by the way, is a radio show which gets disseminated to people's phones.
I would have had to have been psychic to know what a podcast was at that point, I think.
That's right. When I explained it to you and told you that people listen to it on their phones, and you got over the fact that people, you'd be like, what, how do you pick up a phone and listen to a radio show on a phone? Once we got past all of that nonsense, explained what smartphones are, what would you have thought you'd be doing professionally?
Well, definitely writing. Writing was writing books, writing nonfiction books at that point was my whole goal. I got into neuroscience largely because I wanted to have something to write about. So I wanted to write about the mind and the brain and kind of relevant public policy questions intersecting at the boundaries of science and philosophy. And so I went into neuroscience very much with the interest of a philosopher, and the output of philosophy from my point of view was mostly nonfiction books. So yeah, writing was really it. And writing is still, although you wouldn't know it from the last 12 months or so, but writing is still my main job. It's just that podcasting has taken more of my bandwidth.
Did you have any expectation that it might be a challenge to build a career and a following and an income from writing nonfiction books?
Yeah, well, I guess certainly if I had been thinking rationally about it, I would have agreed with that assessment. But when I remember when I wrote my first book, The End of Faith, I didn't have any expectation of what the outcome would be. I mean, I didn't even know it was going to get published when I started writing it, but that was a kind of unique moment because I was reacting very directly to 9/11,
Yeah.
and I just really couldn't have done otherwise at that
I
point.
mean, I think that's what's interesting sort of about your career is that it seems to be somewhat contingent on one big external event, right? I
Yeah,
mean, were it not for
I'm just
that.
a weather vane. I just get blown around by whatever
Well,
shows up.
I'm not implying that, it would be interesting. What do you think your first book would have been had it not been for 9/11?
It, I can tell you, it would have been something much closer to my last big book, Waking Up. It would have been more about consciousness and esoteric things like meditation and spiritual practice and how to understand that in the context of science. So it would have been philosophy of mind and maybe some moral philosophy. So it's something in the area of waking up and the moral landscape. I view those two books as moments where I actually could just dig out from the consequences of 9/11 in my own life and career and actually get to the topics that interested me originally.
I mean, in some ways, 9/11 was, I was about to say a blessing and a curse, but of course the actual event was nothing but a curse. However,
I'd like to see your Twitter feed after you go out with blessings.
Yeah, this will be good. This will be great. Zepps says 9/11 is a blessing. But in the context of your career, it was the thing that was a peg that created your essentially fame and notoriety because The End of Faith was such a salvo against that. It was such a timely book because of 9/11.
Right.
But in another respect, I wonder whether it kind of opened up a rabbit hole for you, and then for the subsequent decade, you were that guy who talks about how bad Islam is. And that probably wouldn't have been the case had it not been for just the historical contingency of 9/11 happening when it did in your life path.
Yeah. Well, and how bad religion is generally was also a distraction. So there's the atheism thing, which I never planned on doing.
Really?
And then there's the specific Islam problem, which I never planned on doing. And those have absorbed a massive amount of my energy. And I keep moving on to other topics, but then I keep getting pulled back to those. So it's not. I've said this before. I do view most of what I've done professionally up until this point as a kind of massive opportunity cost. It's something that I felt like I had to do. I felt like no one was really striking the notes that I felt needed to be struck at least at those points. I mean, obviously there are people who've done many similar things since, but I felt there was a conversation we weren't having on these topics that we needed to have. So I don't regret doing any of it, but I do view it as every time I have to touch these topics, it feels like I'm repeating myself. I'm saying something that I've said 1,000 times before and struggling to find a new way to say it, which is frustrating in its own right.
Have you ever thought about just not?
Well, I do. Now I pick my battles.
But I mean, like literally
yeah.
just releasing a statement saying, I've said everything that I can possibly say about Islam and religion.
Yeah. Well,
everything is out there. There is no shortage of Sam Harris quotes and memes and pod appearances and books. That's it.
Well, more and more I effectively do that, but then novel opportunities or demands come up and it's hard to say no to them. So, for instance, this collaboration with Majid Nawaz kind of came out of nowhere, and it seemed useful to do whatever I could to amplify his voice. So we wrote that book together, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and we did a speaking tour in Australia together, and there's a documentary coming out on our collaboration, I think, at the end of this year, which required more effort. I mean, both of us got on camera, for at least a dozen hours with that team to do that. So, I can't totally go radio silence on this issue, it seems, but more and more I say, listen, I've already said that, so find somebody else.
If you had started with waking up in the moral landscape and 9/11 had never happened, are you optimistic that you would have been able to find the niche that you have, or a niche that is equally profitable?
It's really hard to say. I am optimistic that I would have found some niche. I would have been able to publish what I wanted to publish. I think but who knows? I mean, everything is you have no counterfactual world to.
Yeah, you don't get to
at,
live life alternate life number 2 in order to check. Which is both a blessing and a curse, actually. I kind of like the fact that every decision that you make in life, you can just choose was the right decision. You can just decide to believe that it was the right decision because you don't get any countervailing evidence to the contrary. So you're always right.
That's very existential of you.
um, are there issues on which you care more about being right than others?
Not for the sake of being right. There are issues I care more about than others. Issues of greater consequence than others tend to bring that feeling out in me. But it's not that I mean, there are certainly issues where I feel that I'm more likely to be right than others, and I would be more embarrassed to be wrong than others. I mean, issues more in my wheelhouse. But I'm fairly good at calibrating my confidence with the actual likelihood that I'm right. I'm not often caught out thinking that I was bang on some topic and was just, it turns out I had no idea what I was talking about. I mean, I guess that can happen, but I'm very circumspect in claiming to really know something.
Mm.
And so it's when I'm very, and this is something that I really have had this for a long time, I think, but I now it's really a professional defense mechanism, really, which is I don't want to be wrong for a moment longer than I need to be. So I'm very quick to acknowledge errors or seeming errors, or in fact, I'm too quick. Sometimes something gets pointed out to me as an error, and I acknowledge it, and then it turns out it wasn't an error, and then I either just eat that, or it's so I'm very quick to apologize for misrepresenting somebody's views.
What was the last big course correction that you made?
Well, again, it doesn't happen all that often. So the one thing that hasn't been released yet, but it's a fairly big course correction. It's not based on my publicly having said anything, but the scholar Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve,
controversial for his racial ideas.
Yeah, and widely misrepresented, and I think it's probably the most controversial book, certainly in the U.S. in my lifetime. I don't know if that's worldwide that's the case, but it's hard to imagine a more controversial book than The Bell Curve. I had never read it, and I had never read anything really that he had written that I'm aware of until very recently. And I had always avoided him professionally because he was just radioactive. Like, why would I want to have anything to do with Charles Murray, who's widely derided as a racist and a fascist and a neo-Nazi and a white supremacist and
enough people call you that without having to
exactly.
associate
I've got Ben Affleck calling me a racist on television for what I've said about Islam, as insane as that actually is when you look at the details. But so why would I just wasn't going to go near Murray with a 10-foot pole, and I had never said anything. I had never claimed that any of these claims about him were true, but I had just by default assumed that where there was smoke, there had to be some fire with him. Now, I just had him on my podcast. I'm going to release that probably on Monday. We had a 2-hour more conversation. And I think it's safe to say that he's the most unfairly defamed person in our lifetime, having written the most controversial book in our lifetime. I just think he's been wronged utterly, intellectually, morally. I mean, he's the ultimate canary in the coal mine in terms of how he's been treated by the left generally, but just by his fellow academics. I mean, many did defend him at the time, but so many attacked him, and it was just this moral panic of virtue signaling, and I mean, it wasn't even making contact with the text of his book at all.
Okay, well, now we have to get into that a little bit because I don't want to leave that said without elaborating on it.
Sure.
What was the misunderstanding, do you think, of the book, or the intentional mischaracterization of the book?
Well, there's just nothing. He's simply reporting facts as they were known at the time in the book, facts about the significance of IQ, the reality of IQ, the fact that general intelligence in human beings is a phenomenon that can be measured by IQ tests. It's not that IQ tests just measure the fact that people are good at taking IQ tests. IQ tests actually measure this thing that is referred to as G, or general intelligence, which is the correlation of a person's ability to do many different canonical cognitive tasks well. Language ability, the size of your vocabulary, the depth of your semantic knowledge, your fluid intelligence, your being able to reason about spatial or logical or mathematical things in a way that is actually free of learned knowledge. I mean, it's not, these are, like geometric forms that you need to rotate, etc. And they're free of cultural confounds. The idea that you can't make an IQ test that can survive export into another culture is also just a shibboleth of, liberal craziness, really. And so they're culturally valid. It's not that you can't build a test that isn't culturally valid. That's been done too. But no, we can test IQs of people in different cultures, or they can test themselves. IQ is highly predictive of a person's success in life, not just economically and educationally, but in terms of mortality, in terms of out-of-wedlock birth. I mean, IQ matters, right? I mean, this is so, if you could get one data point on someone to see how they're going to do in a modern society, IQ is probably the data point you would want more than the wealth of their parents or anything else you could get about them. So IQ is both valid and interesting and consequential. Now, he was savaged over that point, which even at the time he wrote the book 20 years ago was not debatable, right? I mean, it's even less debatable now, but it was not debatable in 1994. And as bad luck would have it, but as you would absolutely predict on the basis of just sheer biology, different populations of people, different racial groups, different ethnicities, different groups of people who have been historically isolated from one another geographically, test differently in terms of their average on this measure of cognitive function, right? So if you're going to give the Japanese and the Ashkenazi Jews and African Americans and Hawaiians, I mean, you're going to take populations who differ genetically, and we know they differ genetically, that's not debatable. You're going to give them IQ tests. It would be a miracle if every single population had the exact same mean IQ. And African Americans come out about a standard deviation lower than white Americans. A standard deviation for IQ is about 15 points. So if it's norm to the general population, predominantly white population, for an average of 100, the average in the African American community has been around 85. Now, every community has been going up about 3 points per decade, and that's been called the Flynn effect, something that Murray and his co-author called people's attention to. But in any case, this is an annoying finding. Now, I happen to think there's no reason to seek data like this. I think there's nothing good to do with this data. There are some obviously wrong conclusions that people want to make on this on the basis of these data, but Murray made none of those conclusions. In fact, he was adamant. He and his co-author, Richard Herrnstein, who died, they said all of the cautious and ethical and politically prudent things you would want them to say in the book, and it meant nothing to their detractors. I mean, so for instance, it is in fact true that there's so much more variation within any population for everything, but in particular for intelligence, than there is between populations, that you actually know nothing about a person's intelligence by being told the color of his skin. Right. So to be told that someone's white or black or Japanese tells you nothing about how good they are at anything that interests you. Right. So you have literally no information.
Well, it tells you something at a group level in the same way that someone's propensity to, I don't know, have celiac disease is influenced by their.
Well, it tells you, it gives
biology.
You some.
It gives you a probabilistic kind of
estimate of the frequency that people will be at various points in the bell curve. So the numbers of people in one of these communities who will be, mathematical savants, right, is going to be different depending on the information you have about mean IQ. But still, there is no argument for treating any person as anything other than an individual who needs to be assessed on his own merits, right? So there is no argument for discrimination. There's not a rational argument, and of course, once you add the ethics and the politics to it, of course you don't want to discriminate. And Murray, it seems to me, was just utterly scrupulous in how he presented this. And again, it was just his life, it was like a 20-year witch burning. And the reason why he came back on my radar and the reason why I had him on the podcast is because he was just at Middlebury College, 2 months ago, and was prevented from speaking, shouted down. I mean, this is now, I'm sure your listeners have heard about this incident, because this actually turned violent. They were met by a mob as they were trying to be escorted from the hall by bodyguards, and the professor who had brought him, this is a highly liberal professor who was planning on asking him very challenging questions, was physically attacked by students, right, and got a concussion and had to go to the hospital. I mean, this is happening at a good liberal arts college in the U.S. in the year 2017. In response to not in response to what he's written since the Bell Curve. This is in response to
something he did a quarter of a century ago.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So once you trigger a tripwire touch the stove, when you say that he's a canary in the coal mine, do you mean that the sort of mindless, reactive backlash against touching delicate subjects has become worse than it was in the 90s?
I certainly think it has. I don't have data to go on apart from just the way it seems to me and the way people seem to be talking about it, because I didn't really have a career in the 90s where I would have noticed in the same way. So, but it should be clear that the history of campus protests, even violent ones, goes back obviously much longer than this. It goes back.
Yeah,
to
the 60s. The 60s was a thing.
Yeah, and there's probably more. Maybe there was more violence on campus in the 60s at that point. But it seems to me that the protests had a different structure. At least many of them did, because when you look at the civil rights movement, for instance, what you had there was protest in favor of the rights of people who were being denied, very obviously being denied civil liberties. So, like, lunch counter sit-ins, right? So, this was, at the time, this is an argument for free speech to empower people who are obviously being disempowered. Now we're having people try to close down free speech, people who are empowered, right? These are some of the most privileged college students in the world, right? Kids at Yale, right? Who are trying to stop people from expressing ideas.
But just to play devil's advocate on that point, and I don't want to get too derailed by the free speech argument, because this gets a lot of airtime, and I think there is and this is also something that I want to talk to you about the amount of oxygen that is getting taken up at the moment by portions of the left in their concern about free speech, and how 12 months ago, every time I would go on Joe Rogan's show, we would laugh about how ridiculous political correctness was and how far it had gone, and like how people are getting pilloried for misusing the correct transgender pronoun and so on, and how people are going crazy, uninviting Ian Hirsi Ali to college campuses and so on. But I do feel that in the past 12 months, with what's happened with both the latent racism of the presidential election campaign, and the latent anti-Semitism, sometimes not so latent, and then the rise of the populist right, both in Europe, we're about to see what's going to happen in France, Brexit, Donald Trump. I think anyone who spends all of their time focusing on how ridiculous political correctness is right now and no time focusing on how pernicious the alt-right has become is misallocating their priorities somewhat. And this is no longer something that Joe and I, for example, joke about, because I think it's become, it's ridiculous, but it's so much less of a problem now. I feel like fighting the political correctness and free speech on campus fight today is sort of fighting yesterday's battle, and that today's battle is actually more akin to the day before yesterday's battle, which is the kind of 1960s battle. So, I'm not defending people who are protesting Charles Murray speaking, but the way they would see it is the world is still full of bigotry, and today's fight in defense of the rights of minorities, of black people, of gays, of trans people, has to take a slightly different complexion than it did in the 1960s, that it's no longer about not being able to sit in a particular portion of the bus or the lunch counter. It's now more subtle and insidious forms of discrimination, and that for someone who has written a book about how black people are less intelligent than white people to come on campus, that is emblematic of something that's going on in the zeitgeist, which is associated with oppression. So the narrow free speech rights, like free speech is not the only right to be defended. I can sort of understand, I don't condone that point of view, but can you understand that point of view?
Well, I think it's mistaken. Well, first, let me just be clear about Murray. The bell curve was not about racial difference in IQ. The bell curve was about the consequences of IQ for modern society. So there's only a chapter or two, I think it was just one chapter, I think it's chapter 13, that was on this issue of race. And they almost didn't put it in. They just felt that to complete the picture about just what IQ is and how it's functioning in our society and how it's stratifying our society, they felt that they had to talk about the racial data as well. I can't imagine they were fully aware of how much of a problem that was going to cause for them. But his concern is much more about the stratification of society along cognitive and cultural lines, and that intelligence and the resulting gains that you get from intelligence in a modern society, like education level and economic change. I mean, the fact that 300 years ago, to be 2 standard deviations beyond the mean in mathematical intelligence didn't get you much of anything if you're just pushing a plow alongside your neighbor, right?
He's a genius plowman, though.
Yeah, exactly. But now you can start a software company and then become isolated from your fellow countrymen to a degree that we've now witnessed. We have Silicon Valley that knows nothing about the country they're living in because they're blindsided that Trump is now president, right? So, and his latest book is all about what's the same problem in white America. You've got some significant percentage of white America that is now living in a culture that the quote cognitive elites, this is his phrase, make almost no contact with, and that's why so many smart journalists and other plugged-in people were completely blindsided by the Trump phenomenon.
They're all scrambling for their J.D. Vance books, and they're trying to understand the hillbilly.
Right.
Yeah.
So and Murray would argue that IQ has a lot to do with this. It's not to say that everyone who voted for Trump has a low IQ, but we're witnessing an amplification of the difference, of the consequences of differences in intelligence and education based on information technology and how our economy is becoming dependent on it. So that's just to put Murray's reputation on the shelf there.
Pardon the interruption for a quick message from a sponsor, because this is a sponsor who you will actually want to hear about. I must say that as I look in the rearview mirror and see my youngest years of my youth receding into the past, do find myself misplacing things somewhat more than I did when I was 22 years old. I'm sick and tired of it. I'm sick and tired of wasting precious time always looking for the same things around the house. Well, that's all over. Stop searching and start finding with Tile. Tile is a convenient, tiny little Bluetooth tracker that helps you locate your lost items in just seconds. You attach one of these tiles to your keys or your wallet or your bike or anything that you don't want to lose and you think that you might, and then you use the free Tile app to help locate your lost items. It's so simple, I can't believe that someone didn't invent it before, but they have. It's called Tile. Act now to get free shipping and save 30% per tile on a multi-pack, and for a limited time, get a free gift box. Come on, do it. Go to gettile.com/wethepeople. That's gettile.com/wethepeople.
I think you trivialize it if you refer to what the problem is as political correctness. It's not. Free speech is really the issue, and free speech is the master civil liberty. It is the civil liberty that grounds basically everything, grounds and protects everything we care about, from science to civil rights, other civil rights, to just being able to have any conversation to a point of convergence, right? If you will not let a conversation happen. I mean, there's just no telling what the reality is going to inform us about if we keep looking at it honestly and talking about it honestly. And college campuses are the place where we should be able to do this with the least friction, right? This is where the most uncomfortable ideas need to be protected from or at least given a fair hearing. And what we seem to have is a generation of students who are losing touch with that. And I actually think the diagnosis about, so even granting everything you said about Trump, or about the rise of white nationalism and populism, right-wing populism here and in Europe, what we need is a left now that will not misplay its hand. We can't have we can't have violence on campuses in response to speech be overwhelmingly a phenomenon produced by the left, right? Because that would just validate any kind of crazy crackdown on civil liberties from the right.
Well, yeah, I think that's the best argument against it. In fact, I think is not really an ethical one, but just a pragmatic one. I mean, if you believe in progressive values, you're not going to achieve them by playing into the narrative, the Trump alt-right narrative, that the left is anti-free speech and is crazy and is obsessed and is a violent Antifa thugs.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the fact that Ann Coulter cannot give a speech at Berkeley this week, I think it was this week, because Berkeley cannot figure out how to keep her safe. Berkeley just offers a preemptive mea culpa, saying we can't do it.
Right.
We physically cannot keep you here safely.
You'll get no argument from me on that. I just perceive this as one piece as one jigsaw piece in a big puzzle, and there are a lot of pieces in that puzzle. And I feel like what's happened in the role of sort of public intellectuals and certain professors and so on, without naming names, in the past, sort of since the election of Trump, is that there is a certain cohort of our community who focuses exclusively on that one piece of the jigsaw puzzle without understanding giving an infinite amount of airtime and volume amplification, for example, to alt-right voices because you believe in their right to be able to say the things they're saying, regardless of the content.
It's not that, but it's not like that. I don't have these people on my podcast for a reason.
Well, I'm
right?
not really talking about you because I don't think you do.
Well, no, but
you do that.
But I would say, I want to differentiate these things clearly, because I agree with you that there's no reason to give a platform to a person who you think is an imbecile or dangerously retrograde in his or her ethical commitment. So, like, I don't want to have Ann Coulter on my podcast, right? Like, I don't think there's anything to talk to Ann Coulter about. But if the campus Republicans at Berkeley invited her because they wanted to hear her, there's some number of people who wanted to hear her.
We're talking about two slightly different things. I agree with you that once the invitation has been extended, right, then that's kind of a done deal, and you sort of have to. Then the free speech question kicks in and becomes the overarching value, and you're not allowed to then go and burn a limousine because you don't like Ann Coulter,
right? Or threaten her
life or whatever. But I do think that this free speech punchline gets used as a way of giving voice to these people simply because we want to seem like we're bigger than, that we're not petty. And so in the interests of free speech, it's our obligation, for example, to talk to Ann Coulter because free speech.
Well, no,
that's a red herring.
That is a red herring. It's not, you're not obligated to talk to anyone, but you should recognize that if you want to marginalize and ultimately defeat bad ideas, the way to do that is to argue against them with better ideas.
Yes.
And the fact that the left can't manage to see that and reliably can't manage to see that, I mean, just failing utterly to see that. Ann Coulter is a very easy person to argue against. She's a demagogue. She's a dogmatist. She's occasionally fairly clever, right? So she can get a laugh.
Yeah.
But
she
doesn't
may
have
be a
ideas.
Performance artist as well.
Yeah,
I don't,
exactly.
Where is the, Bill Maher often wonders about her.
Who knows what she
believes? Yeah, exactly. But that question of the left's inability or unwillingness to engage with ideas that it doesn't like leads us nicely into what I really sort of wanted to talk to you about today, which is the role of public discourse and debate, and by extension, the role of the public intellectual in sort of 2017. Because late last year, I was back in Australia for a month hosting radio down there, and I because I was alone and I was nowhere with my family or partner. I spent a lot of time listening to podcasts, and I was put onto the Very Bad Wizards podcast by, I think you had put me onto it, or I heard you mention it or something. And it's just it's a really great podcast, which is it's such a geek out between a philosopher and a psychologist shooting the shit about big questions. And after inhaling about like 50 hours of this damn thing over the course of about 4 days wandering around Bondi Beach, I thought this is an interesting moment in history where we have a technology that is being used to convey highbrow, deep dive conversations that are sort of expanding my mind in interesting ways. And what would I have done if this were 1955 or even 1995? I suppose I'd read books, more books, but I don't know how I would get the real-time sparring, the real-time debates about things that are going on in the world that I can currently get from YouTube or from podcasting. And I wonder, sort of going back to the analogy of where you thought you were going to go 15 years ago, what you make of this, almost the rise of the role of the resurrection of the role of the public intellectual, which I suppose is what you've become, whether by design or not, that occupies a different place than just had you been a writer.
Well, the podcast format is unique in that audio is the only format that you can consume while you do other things. So, I mean, that is one reason why podcasts are, I think we're enjoying a kind of golden age of audio now, because people want to multitask. They want to, so you're getting people while they're commuting or working out, or even just doing other work that they can do that doesn't require much of their cognitive attention. So, if you're a graphic designer who is just doing layout, you can listen to a podcast. Whereas if you're writing a book or doing something that's actually requires discursive language, you can't. But so
you can't listen to a podcast while you're taping a podcast, unfortunately.
No.
That's the bane of my existence as a podcaster.
So the multitasking phenomenon is huge, and so really it wouldn't have been competing with your reading of other books. Audiobooks weren't much of a thing yet, I don't think.
That's true, and I also never sit down and listen to a podcast.
Right.
I'm always walking along the beach, and I'm not going to be walking along the beach reading philosophy.
Yeah, but there are several, for many of us, there are several hours in a day where you could get a podcast in or an audiobook in, but you could get nothing else in other than the radio, right? And podcasts are essentially DVRs for your radio, right? So it's just you can record the episode. I mean, and obviously most radio shows have their own podcast now, so you can just listen to what you want to listen to when you want to listen to it, and it doesn't really compete for reading, at least in my experience.
But it's not just about time shifting; it's also about the democratization of the production of the means of production. So it's not just a radio show, right? I mean, I could listen to it to NPR.
No, I would never have had my own radio show.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and you would never have 3 hours of a couple of people just talking to each other about everything that's going on in the world, or even 1 hour. I mean, when I go back to Australia and I host radio down there, like a long segment is a 15-minute segment. Like that's a really in-depth, deep dive. And then you go to a song,
Yeah.
And when I suggest that we only do 2 guests in an hour, like the producers freak out.
Well, that's why podcasts, in my view, are a much better format for conversation than anything else that exists. Television, you get 6 minutes on CNN, and if you can just get
6 is good. When I do the Today Show or something, it's 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's 2 minutes 45 by the time they've done the cooking segment, and then they throw to you. It's crazy, and that's an interview.
And people are hungry for long-form conversations. There's no question about it.
How do they determine what's right and what's wrong then, and what's worth listening to and what's not worth listening to? Because this then kind of segues us into, the democratization of the means of production of media is fantastic, apart from when it's not, because there are a lot of people who are hoovering up a lot of bullshit as well.
Yeah, well, it's hard. It's like anything else. How do you find a good book to read? Someone reviews it, or it's word of mouth. I mean, you just mentioned the Very Bad Wizards podcast that I'm sure many of your listeners haven't heard of. I've plugged them on social media before. I've been on their podcast, I think twice. Those guys are fantastic and they're hilarious. So
And
now
they throw some shit on you as well.
Oh yeah. No,
occasionally.
I went on once to defend myself because they were
Yeah.
trashing me. But they're very nice guys and they have great chemistry. And David Pizarro is a psychologist, very well regarded psychologist, and Tamler Summers is a philosopher. So they're both academics. And Tamler's actually the stepson of Christina Hoff Summers, who
Oh.
is quite celebrated in slightly right of center circles
Mhm.
for going after political correctness and social justice warriors and all the rest on that side of the menu.
Do you have a way of thinking, like thinking into the future and going, okay, well, I want to get my ideas out there. I like having interesting conversations with people. I think I'm doing something worthwhile with this podcast. What would the next evolution of that be? Is there one yet?
Well, a natural one is to move to video, but for me, that feels like a step backwards in some ways because first of all, it raises the hassle factor for me. I just will be less happy doing it. But it then cancels the advantage of audio, which is the multitasking thing we've just been talking about. A lot of people watch YouTube videos and they just switch to another browser window and just listen to the audio.
It's very peculiar behavior. I know
Yeah.
that a lot of people consume this show that way as well, which is why I have to kind of actually we're going to be launching it on YouTube shortly. But I find that as someone who started out in television and who still sort of thinks of myself as a television host more than or as much as a radio broadcaster, I think why would anyone want to watch something that doesn't add something more than what you would get via audio? Right? Who wants to watch? This is what I don't understand about Joe Rogan's show. Again, I keep mentioning him because I just did his show. But like people sit there for 3 hours and they watch me and Joe talking to each other, and it adds nothing that you wouldn't get by just listening to the audio podcast. But people seem to like it.
Well, it does add something, but again, that's the perfect example because I think this is still the case. Joe told me as recently as I think just the last time I was on, so a month ago, that still 95% of his downloads are audio only, right? So people, even though he puts the video up of everything immediately, it's still just 1/10 of his audience. But it does add something because seeing people's facial expressions, seeing what they look like, I mean, it adds something. It adds a lot, and so people like it for that reason. But again, I just think with audio, you are reaching people in these interstitial moments in their lives where, they're running errands and they're walking down the street with headphones on now. And I've been in the supermarket and had someone just flash his smartphone at me who's playing my podcast at that moment.
That's cool. This raises another question about mindfulness, which and meditation and our state of consciousness in the modern world, because I love listening to podcasts. I always have a podcast in my ears. The only time I'm not listening to somebody talking at me is in the shower when I'm talking at me. My brain chatter is talking at me. And I wonder whether that has an impact on creativity and mental sort of sanity to never have what we used to have, which is prolonged periods of boredom and mandatory reflection, because while you're doing the dishes, there's nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Do you ever worry about that?
I do. I don't worry about it personally for myself because I've spent so much time meditating, and I know what's on the other side of boredom. I know what boredom is. I know boredom really is just a failure to pay close attention to something. Boredom is really an illusion. Boredom is not a problem. You can actually become interested in the feeling of boredom and pay attention to the feeling itself, and then all of a sudden you're no longer bored, right? So boredom is kind of a mirage that you never arrive at if you're paying attention. But most people don't discover this in their lives, I don't think. And now we're living in a world where because you have access perpetually through these devices, in particular the smartphone, you have access to all of the world's information, every movie virtually that has ever been made, every song you've ever loved, everything that you want to pay attention to in virtual space is just a click away. So people will never be bored again necessarily because they can always read. You're never faced with that moment in the doctor's waiting room where you're waiting for an hour and you've just got crappy magazines in front of you that you don't want to read, and there's nothing worth paying attention to. And you might think that's a good thing. I think it's generally a good thing because, again, there's a functionally infinite amount of things that are worth reading and listening to and paying attention to. But there is a real power in discovering that boredom is an illusion and that you can simply pay attention to just the contents of your consciousness, whatever they are, even if it's just your breathing, in a way that becomes deeply rewarding and grounds you in the present moment and cuts through many other illusions. It cuts through the illusion that something has to happen that's interesting or fun or highly pleasurable in order for you to feel good, right? I mean, people are perpetually seeking happiness in each moment by looking over the shoulder of the present moment to what's coming.
Yeah.
What is about to happen that I can look forward to that's good. You know? And that's
rats in the wheel.
Yeah, it is we're on a treadmill, and
I mean, I think
you can get off that treadmill, but it's hard to get off if you don't discover the mechanics of your dis-ease in each moment.
I mean, I think it's worth unpacking two separate things, though, or distinguishing between two separate things, though. One is what you're alluding to there, which is some sort of meditative practice that enables you to create some distance between you and the torrent of bullshit that your brain produces in any given moment, right? But then the other is something much more just pedestrian and everyday, which I think is just sort of daydreaming with no cultivated purpose, but allowing your brain, even unintentionally, to make all the kinds of weird connections that brains tend to make when they don't have anything to do. Even if you're... So, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about we made plans to meet, and I just sort of remembered what it must have been like to make plans to meet somebody before we had smartphones, and there was or mobile phones at all, really. I mean, when I was a kid in my teens, you'd make plans to go and meet somebody at the movie theater, and if they weren't going to be able to make it, there was no way that they could tell you that they weren't going to make it. And if they were 7 minutes late, for 7 minutes, you stood in front of the movie theater and you looked at people walking by.
Yeah.
And you looked at the clouds, and your brain did something. And I wonder whether in those moments your brain is doing something that helps produce creativity in subsequent moments. I know that sometimes when I'm disconnected, if I'm on a plane or something, I know that now you can watch everything and listen to everything on a plane as well, but sometimes I like using it as just an excuse to force myself to be reflective and contemplative, that things happen psychologically and creatively and mentally that don't happen when I'm just back to back to back with podcast, television, conversation, work.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you can overrate the utility of just having a wandering mind that's just coughing up whatever random thoughts are coming moment by moment. I think you get the same thing when you actually meditate, when you actually try through some methodology of paying attention.
I'm finding it hard at the moment, meditating. But
the finding it hard is just the thing that makes it hard is the distraction and the kind of automaticity of thought you're talking about. But that can become very creative in the context of trying to meditate. So that's the thing you think you might be missing because you're always listening to somebody else's content, you can get in the distraction you experience while meditating. So like the most creative thoughts I ever get for passages I should write or project ideas or things I just need to write down lest I forget them because they're so good, that tends to come when I'm trying not to be lost in thought while meditating.
How do you resist the temptation to pick up a pen and write it down?
Well, I don't. Sometimes I do. I mean, this becomes much more of a problem on retreat when you've basically decided for a significant period of time, whether it's a weekend or a week or a month, that there is nothing worth thinking about. You're just going to let every thought go. Now so I've been on retreats for as long as 3 months where I've decided, there's nothing I'm going to read. I'm not going to write. There's no content here that is worth getting fixated on. So let's just see what happens. And in the context of that, and then you develop really unusual levels of concentration in meditation, and you can have just the most creative thoughts you've ever had, and
yeah. So, what if you get an insight that you figure out a way? Oh, this is how quantum theory and classical physics come together, and I am the new Einstein, but I really need a pen to write down the next E equals mc squared, and I don't have one because I'm in the woods.
Well, you might be crazy, but you might have had a good idea, and especially if you're actually a physicist. So I have had retreats totally derailed by this, where I've just decided, okay, no, I got to write this, and so then the next week I'm on a writing retreat as opposed to a actual meditation retreat. But and so that principle applies even in a daily sitting practice, where if you wanted to sit for 20 minutes, you might discover that, okay, this is something that I actually have to get down. I'm going to hate myself for forgetting these ideas. And so you just go to the computer and you take one for the team. But that's I just bring it up because that is, I think, the best version of the thing you think you're missing. Whereas you're trying to meditate, but you're failing because this is all very useful to pay attention to in terms of the content of your own thoughts. Well,
it definitely strikes me that a daily meditation practice, whilst it has always been useful, now more than ever, and probably increasingly so, it is an absolutely necessary patch to solve the problem that I'm pointing to, which is the problem that we don't stand outside of movie theaters for 7 minutes waiting for our friends anymore.
Yeah.
We're looking at Facebook when we do that.
But you can also decide to put the smartphone down. I'm becoming more mindful about that, where it's just because, it's amazing to see. If you've seen the series of photos, I'm sure more than one artist has done this, but there was one who I noticed, whose name I never got. He or she took photos of people looking at their smartphones in various moments in life, but then erased the phone from the picture. So you have these people just staring vacuously into the space of their hands while they're supposed to be seemingly supposed to be relating to their children or doing it. And it is this very arresting image of just the takeover of the human mind by this technology, and it's again, it is a two-edged sword, obviously. But,
I think in 100 years we'll have figured out a better way to interface with the cacophony that is the internet. I mean, for a start, everything will be networked very soon anyway, so the whole idea of there being an internet will soon be redundant. I think that's always an interesting thought experiment as well. Like, when was the last time you heard someone talk about the World Wide Web? It's just everything now. But I think we'll figure out surely superior ways of being in it, rather than just constantly being pinged with little dopamine and serotonin, squirts every time we look at and see that we've got another notification on Facebook or something.
Well, I just had this guy on my podcast, Tristan Harris, who was really good on this point. He's
fascinating.
This is his whole area of inquiry, and he's just looking to see how we can better design our technology for what he calls time well spent. Just so that you're using your time moment by moment, even with your smartphone, that at the end of the day or at the end of the week or at the end of your life, you are not going to regret. It will feel like time well spent, and we don't tend to feel that based on the mere dopaminergic treadmill of responding to every notification or checking Twitter 150 times a day or whatever it is.
How do you write when you're writing?
I don't have a real structure to it. It's been a while since I've had. I can't remember having a real structure in terms of like a schedule. Like I write for the first 3 hours of every day or anything like that.
How does it ever get done then?
Yeah,
this is sort of the bane of every writer, right? I've been writing a book for a number of years now, and it just never seems to finish itself unless I impose the structure.
No, you have to. The structure is you have to sit down and do it. You have to actually get to your desk, and you can't wait for inspiration to take you. But I do tend to be motivated by deadlines. So I write. I often need the stress of a deadline to just clear my desk of other things.
An externally imposed deadline, or are you one of these people who can invent a bullshit deadline and stick to it?
I can do that. I can do both, but I can also cancel externally imposed deadlines,
well, that's true as well.
which I've done of late, and because the podcast and other things have been taking my time. But I'm someone who I think needs a deadline. I need to decide when I'm going to reach certain landmarks with a project, and then just reach them. But in terms of the daily schedule of how I do that, I can write at night, I can write in the morning, I can write for 20 minutes when I'm in the waiting room of the dentist or whatever it is. I can write in a kind of piecemeal way and have that be productive. But as a deadline begins to loom, then I'll by
sit your ass
default,
down and
I need
smash it out.
big chunks of time to just write.
When you say that you can just write in a doctor's waiting room for 20 minutes, how do you dip into the muse that quickly? And do you ever sit down in front of the computer and it's just not coming?
I don't really have writer's block ever, but I can write stuff that turns out to be useless, right? I can write badly. I can go down some byway that is in retrospect a total waste of time. But because I'm so often I'm writing virtually always I'm writing nonfiction, and I'm often reacting to a problem in the world or a set of ideas that just are there to be reacted to, and I'm feeling some need to respond to something that's happened, or so it's not. I'm not often, as you are, let's say, when you're writing fiction, just facing the blank page and then trying to come up with something to put in its place.
Got to figure out what Barney is going to do in the Thanksgiving scene of this universe that I've just pulled out of my ass.
Right.
So if the mission of writing nonfiction is part of having this kind of national or international conversation about things that are going on, the same sort of thing that I suppose we try to do on our podcasts, what do you make of the tenor of the conversation at the moment? I mean, it's everyone goes wild about how terrible social media is and how toxic Twitter has become, right? But even just the level of discourse and argumentation that takes place on, well, I was going to say Reddit. I did Joe Rogan's pod recently, and I may have blundered into suggesting that infanticide was acceptable, was morally acceptable, and should on occasion be legal. And Reddit, I mean, it's just, I also mentioned on the show that I'm having twins, that my partner and I are having twins with a surrogate.
Wow. Oh, congratulations.
And you don't, thank you. You don't even want to know how quickly the Reddit thread about my appearance on Joe Rogan turned into how happy I will be when my surrogate murders my twins
right.
after they're born. I mean, the hostility and degeneracy is literally funny. I actually get a kick out of it.
Yeah.
But it probably doesn't contribute a great deal to conversation. Is this something that has always been with us and now just has a new platform, or do you think that the actual mechanisms and the technologies encourage playing up and the degradation of the discourse?
The technology definitely changes things, and anonymity in particular changes things. So the fact that people are behind a mask of anonymity in these various threads, that just the maniac comes out. And it's interesting that it comes out to a different degree in different threads. So I mean, there's a culture for. I don't spend a lot of time reading comments, frankly, now, because it's I've witnessed the same thing. That it's just this outpouring of bile and lunacy that you don't want to spend a lot of time contemplating. But I've noticed that there is a difference between YouTube comments and Twitter comments and Reddit comments, and they have varying degrees of toxicity when you're on controversial points. I think YouTube is probably the worst for some reason, and I don't know if it's just the demographic. It could be peculiar to me too, but I mean, just the stuff I see in YouTube comment threads in particular is so insane and so relentlessly so that it is not a conversation. And whereas I get hammered fairly hard on Reddit too, but there are Reddit threads that are very highbrow in they're debates about philosophical positions I've taken, say, where you have people who are obviously graduate students in philosophy at least, who are writing mini essays on why I'm wrong or why I'm right, it is providing an opportunity for conversation that is unique and is profitable for people, but anonymity is toxic. So I made a decision a long time ago not to put comments on my blog, and it was more just by virtue of the paucity of time. I just couldn't take the time to do any quality control. I didn't have anyone I could deputize to do that for me, and I just didn't want to invite this carnival of errors and bad vibes onto my own blog. So I never did it, and I'm happy I didn't. But clearly, if you were going to do it well, the first thing you would not allow is anonymity. Everyone has to be themselves, and you and then stand behind the whatever they're saying, and then I think you need real quality control. And I think at a certain point, maybe I would allow comments on my website, but it would require some infrastructure where I just, there is quality control.
To be honest, I'm not sure what the value add is. I mean, I think there's value in technologies that are created expressly for having conversations, obviously, like Twitter and Reddit. But I remember there was an Onion article whose headline was something like, "Man just wants to be able to surf web without being asked to comment on fucking everything." There's like a sense of like, I do just want to consume things sometimes. Like, what reasonable person has ever navigated to Sam Harris's website and been exercised by the absence of a comment thread?
I hear from those people all the time.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because, first of all, people want community. They want to build community. They want to, it's blogs that have comment threads have them for a reason. I mean, if for no other reason than people keep coming back to the article to see how people have commented on their comments. So it drives up traffic immensely.
Sure.
But it would be great if there were a comment thread, if there were a blog or some journal where the comments associated with every article were as good as the article, and it was just smart, well-intentioned people making good faith arguments all the time.
That would be great. But
I think you could create that. But anonymity is the first thing you'd have to get rid of.
I think you'd need to get Charles Murray in to give IQ tests before you allowed.
Anything is possible.
Who was going to be allowed to comment? Yeah. What's your take on infanticide, Sam? Was I wrong to say that it's good to kill babies?
Well, I didn't hear what you said, but in the general case, no. I'm certainly against infanticide.
You're against killing babies. Yes. There's some meme of you talking about eating babies. One of your many memes. In fact, I wanted to run past you some quotes because when you do an image search for you
get some weird stuff.
All these memes of things that you've said, and there's one photo in particular that you took at some stage in your career, which looks the most sinister. Yeah, it's a really evil-looking photo.
It's amazing how, if you don't take steps to control your image, what happens to you. So this is one. I think it was Wired magazine. I'm pretty sure it was Wired. Did an article. This was, I believe, I could have this wrong, but I believe this was the article that spawned the concept of the new atheists. And they took just seemingly deliberately sinister-looking photos of me and Dan Dennett and Richard Dawkins. I don't think Hitch wasn't in the mix at that point, so it was just the three of us. I think it was before Hitch's book came out. And we were lit in this very aggressive way, and we just looked like ghouls, and that seemed to be the point. And so that. And
now everyone's taken that,
and they just put
your critics,
any heinous thing that I said or didn't say on
and
top
they take something out of. Well, so I'm going to give you. So the baby eating thing, which is interesting, says, and I hadn't even made the connection to because I didn't realize I was going to be talking about infanticide. Was Why can't we eat babies? What's wrong with eating babies? If we've got extra babies around that nobody wants, why can't we eat them? Sam
Right.
Harris,
Yeah.
and it's pasted
Okay.
over an image of you looking really ghoulish.
Yeah. Well, that's
with
a joke.
red hue,
Yeah.
a red filter put over your
Yeah.
face, so you
Well-
look like you're covered in blood.
Well, that was actually a joke that I made in the context of talking about this point of being quoted out of context. So I said, I said, like in a philosophy seminar, one of the penalties I pay for having a background in philosophy and speaking rather often in the spirit of a philosopher, is that in a philosophy seminar you can have a sober discussion about anything. You're often raising the corner conditions of any of various ethical problems and principles, and just exploring them. And this is the example I gave. I said, like, you could be in a philosophy seminar, and it could be a totally legitimate question that will be talked about for an hour by sober, well-intentioned people. Why can't you eat babies? If there's a lot of babies around and people don't want them, why? What is wrong with eating babies? Right? So a professor at Harvard can ask his graduate seminar that, hoping to provoke a good argument about the underpinnings of our ethics. Now, that's not a quote that survives export very well to in a journalistic context or on Twitter.
No, it's not a good meme.
But I was making that point, and then so someone maliciously, but not even, I mean, in their mind, it was just pure fun, because it's obviously someone who agreed with me who first created that meme. But
this is like, I mean, our last encounter went this way as well, where we were trying to have a conversation about how to have conversations about difficult things without getting emotionally hijacked, and we were emotionally hijacked by the fact that Hannibal Buress had been drinking a little. And that podcast episode ended up being proof of precisely the point that we had been trying to make, but in the worst possible way.
Right.
Indeed, that episode with Sam Harris and Hannibal Buress was a doozy. If you want to revisit it or listen to it for the first time if you haven't heard it, it's well worth a listen. It's episodes 52 and 53 of We the People Live. It was a show in two parts, as indeed is this one, because I just can't shut up when I'm around Sam Harris, so we have to cut him down. Rest assured that longer conversations, as well as ad-free conversations, will be some of the things that we're going to be looking at as we roll out our Patreon page. In part two of the chat with Sam next week, we dig into some really interesting stuff, the things that he has written that he would unwrite. We also have a pretty deep and original conversation about the nature of consciousness and artificial intelligence and what it means to have a mind, what it means to have feelings. Whether iPhones indeed might even think like ants do. Trust me, it gets interesting. All that and more on part two of my conversation with Sam Harris next week on We the People Live.